The envelope felt oddly warm when Callum Price slid it from the realtor's trembling hand. It was just paper, ink, and an old wax seal, nothing unusual on the surface. But something about it made his fingers tingle. The house had gone up in one of those viral buy property for pennies auctions. The kind desperate towns put out when the last streetlight flickers and the last post office closes. $100. That's all it took. A few signatures, a handshake, and a whisper that he tried to ignore. "You sure you want to stay in that house, boy?" The man behind the desk had leaned in, eyes glassy with something that wasn't just age. "It's never been empty." Not really. Callum hadn't come for ghost stories. He came because his money was gone, his luck was broken, and his name was barely holding on after the divorce and the job loss that followed like a loyal dog. He needed quiet. He needed time. And more than anything, he needed someplace cheap enough to disappear in. The town was a dot on a forgotten map, surrounded by pine, silence, and the kind of roads that killed tires. He hadn't seen another person in hours when the house finally came into view, 2 stories of warped wood and sun-faded shingles, nestled behind a fence that looked like it had never been finished. But it was the porch that gave him pause. 3 rocking chairs, side by side, moving, slowly, and not a breeze in sight. He parked the truck anyway. Killed the engine. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, like standing in a room where someone had just screamed. He climbed out, the gravel crunching beneath his boots like warning bells, and walked the path toward the house with the deed rolled tightly in his hand. The front door stood open, not wide, but enough to suggest invitation or expectation. A gust of unease made him check his phone, no bars. Of course not. There hadn't been signal since the highway. He mounted the first step of the porch and the floorboards creaked beneath his weight, not just once, but 3 times. 1 for each rocking chair. As if answering a roll call, Callum paused, halfway between courage and common sense, wondering if he should call out or just walk in. But before he could decide, a voice clear, strong, and unmistakably female cut through the air like a sermon at dawn. "You finally made it," she said. "Took you long enough." Callum turned, heart lurching against his ribs. 3 women stood in the doorway, each nearly a head taller than him, each with eyes that didn't blink nearly enough. One stepped forward, hands on her hips, frame blocking out the light behind her. "We were starting to think they wouldn't send anyone we could lift." The sentence made no sense. Not yet. But as Callum stood frozen, deed clenched in his damp palm, he understood one thing with perfect clarity: he hadn't bought this house. He had been delivered to it. Callum didn't speak at first. The woman's presence had knocked the breath out of him, not from fear, but from sheer displacement. It was like someone had rearranged the laws of scale. She stood at least 6'7", with wide shoulders wrapped in a wool shawl despite the heat. Her auburn hair was pulled into a thick braid that swung slightly with each movement. Behind her stood 2 others, equally tall, equally still, as if they had emerged from the house itself. Callum blinked to make sure they were real. They didn't blink back. "Are you living here?" he asked finally, voice sounding small in the open air. The one in front stepped off the porch. He heard the wood sigh beneath her weight, not from fat, but from muscle dense and deliberate. She nodded once. "We never left," she said plainly. "Just waited." Callum opened his mouth to say something, anything, but she turned back to the others. "He's got the look," she said, and the way the other 2 nodded made his skin crawl. The second woman had ash blonde hair and wore dark denim overalls like armor. Her arms were crossed tight over her chest, biceps like braided rope. The third, a softer figure with darker skin and tightly coiled curls, had a calmness to her stance that somehow made her feel the most dangerous of all. She didn't need to posture. She just watched him with a stillness that unnerved him more than yelling ever could. "I didn't know this place came with tenants," Callum said, forcing a smile he didn't feel. The auction didn't mention anything about roommates. The blonde one scoffed, but it was the leader who spoke again. "You own the deed," she said, tapping the rolled paper still clutched in his hand. "But not the story." "Not yet." Callum furrowed his brow. "What story?" The third woman finally stepped forward. Her voice was smooth, almost apologetic. "You'll know soon. But first, tell us your name." "Callum Price." The name seemed to ripple across them like a breeze. The blonde whispered something under her breath. Callum couldn't catch it, but it made the leader's lips curl into something between a smile and a dare. "Callum," she repeated, tasting the syllables. "Good. That's one we haven't had before." He took a step back, suddenly hyper-aware of his surroundings. His truck, the empty road, no signal, no neighbors. Look, I don't mean to be rude, but if this is your house, it's not. The leader interrupted. It's ours, but it's also yours. That's the part people always get wrong. What does that even mean? Callum asked, trying to steady his breathing. The third woman stepped even closer, gaze warm but weighted. It means the house doesn't pick just anyone. And it picked you. Callum's grip on the deed tightened. The paper had started to wrinkle under the sweat of his palm. He had come here for peace, solitude, simplicity. But as the sun dipped behind the trees and 3 shadows stretched across the porch, he realized he'd just stepped into something ancient, something waiting. Callum wanted to laugh. Not from humor, but from the brittle tension crawling across his skin. He had been in strange situations before, bar fights gone sideways, a bad camping trip with coyotes too close to the fire, but this was different. This wasn't danger in the way he understood it. It was older, slower, like falling asleep in a dream that's not yours. Listen, he said, gesturing with the deed. I paid for this house. It was auctioned legally. I have the paperwork, the registration number. We know, the auburn-haired woman interrupted. We watched the auction. You what? We watched you bid, the dark-skinned woman added. It was the first time someone with your balance had the courage to click confirm. Callum blinked, stunned. My balance? The blonde stepped down now, her boots hitting the ground like punctuation. Not too heavy, not too light, not full of yourself, not empty either. We've had all kinds try. You're the first one we might not break. Break? Callum took a step back, heart rate stuttering. Break how? The leader shrugged, but it wasn't casual. It was deliberate. You'd be surprised how many men think they can handle women like us. Then the weight shifts, and the truth comes out. I don't even know your names, he said, half in protest, half stalling for time. I'm Tessa, said the auburn-haired one, lifting her chin. Lark, said the blonde, crossing her arms again. Maris, said the quiet one, her tone soft, like wind through tall grass. Callum nodded, repeating their names silently to himself, as if naming the storm could somehow keep it from hitting. Okay, Tessa. Lark. Maris. I'm just a guy who bought a fixer-upper for $100 because his life fell apart and he wanted anything to start over with. I'm not part of a test. I'm not looking to be lifted. The last word came out with a twist of irony, but none of them laughed. Maris stepped forward, eyes locked on his, and placed her hand on his shoulder. Her grip was light, but he could feel the strength beneath it. You don't understand. This house doesn't belong to the county. It never did. It belongs to us. And we belong to something older than deeds and signatures. Lark added. You didn't just buy this house, Callum. You were chosen by it. He shook his head, half in disbelief, half in fear. I was chosen by a listing. An algorithm picked me. Not magic. No, Tessa said. It wasn't magic. It was desperation. And desperation listens. A silence followed. Heavy. Breathing. Callum swallowed hard. You're saying this house waited for me? Tessa nodded. Not just you. A man we could lift. Lift for what? He asked, barely above a whisper. To see if you rise or collapse. Callum didn't move. The sun was gone now, the porch in shadow, and all that remained was the sound of wood groaning beneath ancient weight, and the women waiting, watching still unblinking. Callum sat at the kitchen table, if it could still be called that. The wood was old, darkened by time and oil and something else he couldn't name. Tessa poured tea into a chipped mug without asking if he wanted any. The way she moved around the space made it clear this wasn't hospitality, it was ritual. Lark leaned against the doorway like a sentry, arms folded, jaw clenched, while Maris stood near the window, hands clasped in front of her, eyes watching something in the orchard that only she could see. No one said a word for what felt like 10 full minutes. The silence was no longer threatening, it was sacred. Tessa finally broke it. 100 years ago, a man built this house for 3 women. Sisters, born to the same mother but different fathers. The land gave them strength, and the land demanded sacrifice. The man promised to marry them all, to bind them and protect them, but when harvest came, he took the crops and vanished. She set the kettle down with a controlled grace. He didn't just leave them, he cursed them. Callum frowned. Cursed how? Lark's voice cut in, low and even. Each season that passed, the house grew colder. Not in temperature, in trust. The sisters made a vow never to be touched again. Not until someone arrived who could carry all three of them, emotionally, physically, spiritually. Maris turned from the window, speaking so softly it made the others still. And each generation after them has kept that vow. Daughters raised by daughters, strength passed down like seed. We are the last. Callum didn't know what to say. The story sounded like folklore, the kind passed around bonfires by people who'd spent too much time alone. But there was no mockery in their eyes. No laughter hiding in their throats. This was belief. This was law. Why stay here? He asked. Why not leave? We can't, Tessa said simply. The vow is tied to the house, to this land. If we break it, everything we are dissolves. We lose what little we have left of who we were, Lark added. And we don't want to leave. We want it restored. Properly. Maris walked closer, her gaze pulling him in like a tide. But to restore it, we need a man who doesn't flinch when touched, who doesn't run when tested, who doesn't shatter when lifted. The words hung in the air like smoke from a long-burned fire. So you've been waiting? Callum asked. All this time, just waiting for someone? Tessa's expression didn't soften, but her voice did. Not someone, the right one. The house doesn't let us choose, it calls. And it called me? All three women nodded. What if I leave? Lark stepped forward, closer than before. Then the house waits again. But we don't. We end the line. The tea sat untouched. The kettle had long since gone quiet. And Callum, for the first time since arriving, realized this wasn't just an opportunity. It was a blood debt, and the payment was him. Morning came in slow waves. Light bled through the cracked window panes, revealing dust that danced in the quiet like it had always lived there. Callum hadn't slept much. He'd laid on the stiff cot in the back room, the house creaking around him like it breathed. Sometime after midnight, he thought he heard whispering beneath the floorboards. Not words, tones. Like lullabies spoken in a language his bones almost understood. When he finally emerged into the kitchen, Tessa was already waiting. She handed him a tin of cornbread and a jug of water without saying a word, then nodded toward the back door. The field stretched beyond the orchard, long and lean, rimmed with tall sunflowers that bowed slightly in the wind. A shovel leaned against the fence. A wheelbarrow sat beside a pile of rusted fencing. You'll work today, Tessa said. We need to know what you're made of. Strength test? He asked, trying to make light of it. Everything test, Lark said, appearing from around the barn. Strength, endurance, willingness. We don't break people with fists. We break them with truth. Callum took the shovel, its handle smoothed by years of use. The women didn't give him direction, just space. The morning passed in labor redigging irrigation lines, moving stones, hauling lumber to a shed that hadn't seen use in a decade. They didn't hover, but they were always there, watching, measuring, not just his muscles, but his mood, how he reacted to frustration, whether he cursed the tools or adapted, whether he'd cut corners when no one was looking. He didn't. He couldn't. Something about the place made honesty feel heavier than any log. By midday, sweat clung to every inch of him, and his palms ached from the shovel's bite. He paused under a walnut tree, heart hammering in his chest, and that's when Maris approached. She carried a cloth and a glass bottle of something clear and cold. Without a word, she dabbed the sweat from his brow, eyes never leaving his. It was gentle, practiced, not flirtation, not nurture, something older than both, a kind of spiritual tending. Why this? Callum asked, voice rough from thirst. Why test me like this? Because men lie with words, she said, but they tell the truth when their backs hurt. Later, Lark led him to the barn and asked him to lift bales of hay onto high shelves. Not to impress, but to understand leverage. Your spine doesn't lie, she said. Neither do your knees. Tessa joined him by dusk, handed him a hoe, and gestured to the raised beds. These need turning, she said, then paused. That's what this place does, Callum. It turns you. Into what? Though that's the test. He worked until the sky turned the color of burnt copper. No one thanked him when he stopped. No one needed to. As he walked back toward the porch, blistered and raw, they stood waiting. And none of them asked if he was tired. They asked only one thing. Do you still want to stay? The fire crackled low in the hearth that night, casting long shadows that danced across the walls like echoes of people long gone. Callum sat on a worn couch, his muscles burning from the day's work, but his mind too alert to rest. The three women moved through the room with quiet coordination, Tessa tossing logs into the fire, Lark sipping something strong from a jar, Maris stitching the hem of a curtain with deliberate care. None of them spoke, but it wasn't an absence of words. It was the kind of silence that asks permission to tell the truth. Callum cleared his throat. You mentioned others before. People who tried and didn't pass? Tessa stopped mid-motion, her eyes locked on the flames. One man, the only one who ever made it past the first night. He told us what we needed to hear, then did exactly what we feared. Lark let out a bitter laugh. He had charm. Big smile, bigger stories. Said he was going to turn this place into a sanctuary. Said he understood us. He understood nothing. Maris added, her needle pausing mid-stitch. He said he loved us. All three of us. Promised to marry each of us in our own way. Said love didn't need to be linear. Callum shifted in his seat. But he left? No, Tessa said softly. He stole. Lark stood up now, pacing the room, energy too restless to contain. He took the heirloom rings, sold the oxen, took the iron seed keys, those unlocked the grain silos. We lost 2 winters' worth of reserves. Said he'd come back with more. Said he just needed liquidity. We haven't seen him in 3 years. Callum frowned. Why didn't you go after him? Maris looked up. We did. We found the town where he landed, living fat, surrounded by girls half his age. Told people we were witches, said we had cursed him, that he barely escaped. They believed him. We left before they burned the house we were staying in. The silence settled in again, thick with betrayal and memory. Callum leaned forward. So what do you think I am? A replacement? A rebound? Another fool? Tessa met his eyes, and her voice was steel-wrapped in velvet. We don't think anything yet. We watch, we listen, we feel. And you feel what? He asked, not as a challenge but as a man who had started to care. Maris answered first, voice hushed. You didn't look for a way to win. You looked for a way to understand. Lark nodded, arms folded. You didn't break anything today. Not a tool, not a rule, not even yourself. Tessa walked toward him, stopping just short of touching. You came here hollow, but not empty. There's still something in you that wants to build. That's rare. Callum looked down at his blistered hands. And if I turn out like the last one? Lark's voice came from behind him, low and final. Then we bury you where he should have been. The next morning, Callum woke to a knock on his door, not loud, but rhythmic, like a heartbeat wrapped in wood. When he opened it, Maris stood there in a loose linen robe, the color of old parchment. She said nothing, just gestured for him to follow. He didn't ask where they were going. At this point, questions seemed useless. He pulled on his boots and stepped into the cool morning air, trailing behind her as she walked barefoot through the dew-covered grass toward the far end of the orchard. The trees thinned into a clearing where Tessa and Lark were already waiting. Tessa was rolling up the sleeves of a canvas shirt, her thick arms glistening with sweat despite the early hour. Lark stood beside a large wooden platform, like the kind used for old barn raisings. No one smiled, no one explained. The mood wasn't playful, it was solemn, sacred. Maris turned to him. We told you the house chooses, but it's not the only thing. We do too. Callum glanced between them. This is another test? No, Tessa said. It's a ritual. Lark nodded. You don't pass or fail. You just are. He stepped onto the platform because not doing so felt like lying. Lark approached first. She circled him once, then stood behind him, placed her hands gently under his arms, and without warning lifted. He expected strain, grunting, at least some resistance, but she raised him like he weighed nothing. His boots left the platform. The wind shifted. His heart skipped. For a moment, the world went quiet. Then she set him down. Next came Maris. Her hands were softer, and when she lifted him, it felt less like being hoisted and more like being carried by intention. Her eyes never left his. She didn't smile, didn't speak, just held him in the air for 3 full seconds before lowering him gently. Tessa stepped forward last. He wasn't sure what to expect. Of the 3, she was the one who felt most like a storm waiting for permission. She didn't ask. She didn't warn. She just moved. Her grip was firm and exacting. When she lifted him, it wasn't effortless, but it was powerful, like something sacred had come alive in her bones. His chest tightened. Her breath was steady. When she lowered him back down, she whispered something he couldn't hear. What was that? He asked, Tessa looked him straight in the eye. That was the moment I decided I believe in you. They all stepped back. Callum stood on the platform, feet grounded but mind floating. What does it mean? It means you didn't shatter, Maris said softly. It means we can move forward, Lark added. With you, Tessa finished. If you choose it. Callum looked at them, three women who had built a life no one understood, bound by vow, soil, and something older than law. And somehow, impossibly, he had passed their measure, not by proving himself, but by letting them lift him without fear. That night, Callum sat alone at the kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper in front of him and a fountain pen that looked too elegant for his calloused hands. The women had left him with it after dinner, along with a single instruction from Tessa: write the agreement, in your own words, no copying from a lawyer, no fine print. This has to be yours. It had sounded simple enough when she said it. But now, as the clock ticked and the fire guttered low in the hearth, he understood the weight behind the request. They didn't just want his labor. They wanted his intent. He stared at the page until the words blurred. This wasn't about joining a business or co-signing a deed. It was about stepping into a story that was already in motion, one shaped by loss, betrayal, and the kind of vows that outlived bloodlines. And now, they were asking him to shape what came next. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from reverence. He had never written anything in his life that mattered this much. He began slowly, not with legalese, but with truth. I, Callum Price, enter into a partnership with Tessa, Lark, and Maris. I do this willingly. I recognize their stewardship of this land and their sacrifices for it. I commit to protect it, build with it, and honor its history. He paused. The fire cracked behind him, and the words seemed to echo in the wooden walls like a promise being absorbed. He kept writing. I make no claim of ownership, only of purpose. I will contribute labor, ideas, and presence. I will speak honestly, listen deeply, and remain until our work here feels complete to all of us. I ask nothing in return but trust and the chance to earn it. He scratched out a line, rewrote it cleaner. This agreement is not just between us, but with the house, with the land, with whatever force still watches over this place and decides who may enter and who must leave. He set the pen down and exhaled. The paper was only half filled, but it felt whole. He hadn't listed percentages or chore divisions. He had written a vow, one that felt more binding than any contract he'd ever signed in his old life. He folded the paper, careful not to crease it too sharply, and stepped into the hallway where the women waited, not hovering, but present, as if they already knew. Tessa took the page and read it silently, lips moving with the words. When she finished, she passed it to Lark. Lark read slower, her expression unreadable until the final line, when something softened. Maris read last. Her eyes filled with something Callum couldn't name, maybe relief, maybe forgiveness, maybe belief. Tessa met his gaze. You didn't just write what we needed to hear. Callum nodded. I wrote what I needed to say. Lark unfolded the paper, smoothing it flat on the table. Then it's real, Maris whispered. Then we begin. The mornings came earlier now. Callum no longer needed an alarm or the creak of floorboards to wake him. His body had begun to rise with the rhythm of the house, the soft sighs of settling beams, the chirp of birds returning to the orchard, the rustle of leaves that whispered like they had always known his name. The farm, once a haunted corner of forgotten earth, now pulsed with life. Crops stood taller. The chickens laid double. Even the soil smelled richer, like it had accepted his presence as something earned. The contract he wrote still hung in the hallway, framed in simple wood, not for legality but memory. Proof that promises didn't need signatures to be binding when they were made with intention. He'd split the land with Tessa, Lark, and Maris not in ownership, but in soul. Each day they worked together, repairing fences, bartering goods at the trading post, planning irrigation routes under the stars. And at night, they didn't sleep in a single bed. He rotated, not out of duty, but out of desire. Some evenings called for Tessa's grounding presence, her hands strong and sure as they traced the day's labor into the muscles of his back. Other nights, Lark met him in the moonlit hallway with a look that said she needed quiet, just him, and the silence between words. And then there were nights he spent in Maris's room, where stories flowed like water and his breath matched hers in perfect, wordless harmony. No one spoke of jealousy. The house didn't allow it. There were rules here, Yes, but not the kind the outside world wrote. These were rules of balance, of give and take, of seeing the full person in front of you and letting them see you back. And that vulnerability, that terrifying openness, had become the most valuable thing they shared. One afternoon, as the four of them sat on the expanded porch overlooking fields they'd planted together, Tessa turned to Callum and asked, "Any regrets?" He looked at each of them in turn. Tessa with her strength that masked so much patience, Lark with her fierce gaze that softened only for him, Maris, whose quiet wisdom could heal a wound before it broke the skin, and then he looked out at the land, glowing in the last gold of summer. "Only one," he said finally. The three women turned toward him, waiting. That I didn't come sooner. Their laughter carried over the fields, not loud, but full the sound of people who had finally found what they didn't know they were missing. The house seemed to settle deeper into its foundation, as if pleased with how the story had turned. Later that night, Callum passed the hallway with 3 doors and paused. He didn't choose one. Instead, he stepped back, walked outside, and stood barefoot on the earth. The sky above shimmered with stars that had witnessed every vow made beneath them, and somewhere inside, 3 women waited, lifting not just him, but the future they'd built together.